Today, I'm going to be speaking with Jonathan Berman, who's a professor, national co-chair of the 2017 March for Science, and also author of Anti-Vaxxers, How to Challenge a Misinformed Movement. Jonathan, so great to have you on today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
So let's see. To start with, my conception of the anti-vaccine movement, which I've studied over time, is that you have right and left wing so-called anti-vaccine folks, often motivated in different ways. I tend to see the right wing anti-vaccine is more based in skepticism of government, whereas the left wing anti-vaccine is more skepticism of big pharma. So first question, am I right that this sometimes crosses political lines? Is it along the lines I laid out?
Yeah, for the most part. So up until very recently, there wasn't a big difference between left and right as far as vaccine skepticism. Over the last few years, there's been a pretty big rightward shift. I just was reading a paper indicating that there's a strong, the second strongest predictor of anti-vaccine sentiment right now is Christian nationalism.
Mm.
So there have been some changes in the demographic makeup of the anti-vaccine movement, like you would expect with a big event like the pandemic going on.
What would you say? So currently, maybe we'll start now and maybe work backwards if it makes sense. We've seen vaccine skepticism over the coronavirus vaccine decline overall over the last year. I think there was a point last year where something like 60% of Americans said they weren't interested, and that dropped to 50. And the latest numbers I saw are about 28 or 30%. Is the current situation unique historically, or is it typical that when there is the surgence of a new communicable disease that there is more hesitancy that declines?
I was initially skeptical of those survey numbers
Mm,
for the reason that for diseases like measles, we've seen high degrees of skepticism on surveys. But then when the rubber hits the road, when it's time to actually get vaccinated, we see very high numbers of vaccination, high compliance. So there's something about the way those surveys tend to be written, or something about the way that people respond to them, that that makes people a little bit uh, hesitant to say they're going to get it, but then get it. So when it was saying 40%, 30, I think it's going to be higher than that. Um, so that's not surprising that as people get vaccinated, people are relaxing a little bit about their skepticism.
One of the things I would imagine will move some people who might genuinely be on the skeptical side to the I want the vaccine side would be if airlines, for example, say after a certain date, you'll need to be vaccinated to fly with us, or you can avoid a quarantine if you're vaccinated, or if you want to come to an event where tickets are sold by Ticketmaster or Live Nation, you'll need to be vaccinated. I think that will certainly be a factor. But beyond those sort of, I want to be able to do X type of things, what tends to bring people out of vaccine skepticism?
Right. So as far as what governments can do, like you said, you have these non-coercive measures, and ideally, we don't want to be coercing people, because that's when people become most resistant, is when they feel like they're being coerced. So what seems to help is seeing people who belong to the same groups as them, um, getting vaccinated, people who have similar backgrounds, similar socioeconomic status, similar race and religion, um, getting vaccinated. In the United States, so for example, there is strong vaccine hesitancy in the Black community,
Right.
um, but that's partially predicated on a history of medical racism. And addressing that is going to be an important part of persuading people in that community, maybe less important for persuading um, Orthodox Jews or white evangelicals. So I think the most important thing we can do is to sort of target our messaging to the groups we're speaking to.
That's interesting. Yeah, the three currently most vaccine hesitant groups that I looked at, and again, this is as you mentioned, if we can trust the data, it's Black Americans, Republicans, and those without college degrees. What would it be that would be more likely to be convincing to, for example, just Republicans?
Right. So there's this moral foundations theory in psychology that says that people who tend to be more conservative respond more to certain moral foundations, and people tend to be more liberal respond to other moral foundations. And
Right.
so the ones that conservatives, I think, respond more to are sort of disgust, loyalty, um, and so we want to frame messaging around those moral foundations, in my opinion. So we would want to, talk about when people say these are chemicals, these are outside substances you're putting in your body. What's really in there? What does it mean? What's it there for? And then have the discussion with them about bodily autonomy, control over what medical treatments are being performed on them, and make sure it's clear that this is not a case of government overreach and that public health measures are an important part of the functions of government that they should hopefully accept.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt has written a lot about what the as you point out, the values that are more relevant and motivational to different groups of people. When it comes to vaccine skepticism, are there examples from history where it was justified to be skeptical of a vaccine?
So there have been instances in history where things have gone wrong, and there were mistakes made in manufacturing of a vaccine, or I
we're,
apologize for my
we're
dog.
welcoming we're welcoming your dog to the interview now, which is fine. The
Yes.
audience loves dogs.
Sadie sees someone outside delivering a package, and she's very angry. Say hi to Sadie.
There she
Hi,
is.
Sadie. So yeah, there have been instances in the past where mistakes have been made, or in manufacturing, or where in the 70s there was a flu pandemic that was predicted that never came about, and there was a vaccine that very slightly increased the risk of Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Right.
Um, so those things have happened in the past, and that's why it's not unreasonable to be cautious, right? So that's why we test vaccines with thousands and thousands of people before they come to market, and that's why these things are reviewed by government panels. And these are, the saying is regulations are written in blood. A lot of these regulations have come about because of those mistakes. A really big important one was the Cutter and Wyeth Labs incident in the 1950s. There was about 200,000 doses of polio vaccine.
Right.
Um, and that vaccine design involved live poliovirus that was inactivated. It wasn't killed because viruses aren't alive, but it was made unable to infect people with, I believe it was formaldehyde, and it was improperly done. So this vaccine that was sent out was able to infect people, and so about 200 people had a paralyzed limb where they were injected or with that vaccine. And so that led to the creation of some of these government agencies that are responsible for that regulation.
One that I've been getting maybe, 10 or 12 emails about over the last few weeks as we've talked about vaccines is folks who write to me and say, David, clearly vaccines can do harm because there is this vaccine injury compensation apparatus that the government has created, and that wouldn't be there if this wasn't a thing. So therefore what, I guess, is the question.
Right. So the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program came about in the 1980s, and there had been a paper in 1974 that alleged or seemed that seemed to show that there was, from the Tdap vaccine, an increased risk of neurological problems. And so that led to people saying, oh, is that true? And a bunch of studies. Eventually we figured out, no, it's not true. But the consequences of that were a wave of countries deciding that they would no longer vaccinate for, I'm sorry, DPT vaccine,
DPT.
diphtheria pertussis. Yeah, they would no longer vaccinate for pertussis, and there was a wave of outbreaks that followed in those countries where pertussis came back, whooping cough, a lot of sick kids. And in the U.S., there were only a handful of companies that manufactured pertussis vaccine. So lawyers saw this and they decided, okay, we're going to start suing these companies manufacturing DPT, and we'll use this paper as evidence. And so there was at least one, I believe possibly two companies that went out that said, we're not going to make it anymore. It's too big a liability. We'll be sued out of existence. And Congress saw this and they realized that if we continue allowing people to sue based on flimsy evidence, these vaccine manufacturers, we won't have a vaccine supply. So they kind of came up with this idea that's not perfect, and which is the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So, excuse me, if you are vaccinated, then in the next few days you develop certain symptoms, you are certain that they have defined as possible vaccine injury. They will compensate you. And you can go to the vaccine court and the government will compensate you instead of suing the vaccine manufacturer out of existence. And that's not perfect because that takes away some of the liability if they actually do something wrong.
Right. And how common are the claims?
I don't have the number off the top of my head. It's fairly common for people to file claims. They have paid out a lot over time. The trouble is that the standard of evidence required by the vaccine court is very different from the scientific standard of evidence that I or other scientists would require to say this is demonstrated to my satisfaction as provisionally true in the lab.
Right. So it's a standard that allows maybe for more successful filings than a more rigorous method would.
Yeah. So legal proceedings don't always track with scientific methods.
Right. Yeah. Listen, last thing I wanted to touch on, when it comes to the rollout of the coronavirus vaccine, we now have the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines approved, and they've been out through emergency use. They've been out for a bit. I've received both doses of the Moderna. We now have the approved via EUA Johnson & Johnson. We may have a fourth vaccine on the way. I'm reassured right now by two things. One, we have gone from 890,000 vaccinations a day to 2.1 million. That number seems to continue to climb. Number two, the latest study I saw in the New England Journal of Medicine on effectiveness against the three primary variants, UK, Brazil, and South Africa, remains quite good. So in total, is it logical to be pretty optimistic right now about the next 4 to 6 months?
I am both optimistic and worried. I'm optimistic because for the reasons you state, we've started to do a good job of ramping up the rate of vaccination.
Yep.
And the vaccines are pretty good for those variants. However, here's why I'm worried. There are the Brazilian and the New York City variants. The Brazilian variant seems to escape immunity from people who've already been infected with coronavirus. So,
in other words, vaccines aside, if you got the virus a year ago and then you get the Brazilian variant today, you are not immune from the old infection.
You may not be.
You may not be. Okay.
So that's something to watch and be concerned about. We don't know yet that vaccines don't provide better protection.
Right.
But it's something to be concerned about. And the New York City variant is still a question mark. That seems to be infecting people faster than you would expect, given the number of cases New York City has already had.
In other words, still not based on vaccination, but based on New York City having a lot of early infections, and yet they're having a lot of new infections with that variant.
Yes. And the other reason I'm worried is that there is some inequity in the distribution of the vaccine.
Yes.
So 10 countries have, I think, 70% of the available vaccine. And there are more than 10 countries in the world.
Yes.
So it's going to take, I think, up until 2024, 2025 until vaccine can be distributed worldwide. And because viruses don't care about national borders, that means coronavirus is going to be something that we deal with for a very long time, even if wealthy countries do a great job of vaccinating.
And regardless, in all circumstances, the quicker we can vaccinate now, the better everybody is, right? I mean, all else being equal.
That's right. So right now, the way I see it, we're in a race.
Yeah.
And the race is between the mutation rate of these coronavirus variants and vaccination. So the faster we can vaccinate people, the fewer cases there are, the fewer chances to mutate there are.
Makes perfect sense. Jonathan Berman, professor, national co-chair of the 2017 March for Science, and also author of Anti-Vaxxers, How to Challenge a Misinformed Movement. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. Sorry about my doggie.
No, everybody loves the dog.